The auction yard woke slowly, as if reluctant to face the day. Fog clung to the ground in thin, wavering sheets, blurring the edges of rusted gates and weather-beaten trailers. The air smelled of damp hay, old iron, and animals that had learned patience the hard way. Boots shuffled through mud, voices stayed low, and somewhere a bell rang with tired insistence. It was the kind of morning that pressed down on a man's shoulders, inviting him to keep his head lowered and his thoughts to himself. He stood apart from the others, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, shoulders curved inward as though bracing against more than the cold. His name barely mattered here. He had driven in before sunrise, not because he needed a horse, but because sleep had refused him again. Home felt too quiet these days, too full of echoes that followed him from room to room. Among strangers and livestock, he could pretend he was simply another face in the crowd, unobserved and unburdened. The auctioneer's voice cut through the mist, rhythmic and detached, assigning numbers and prices to living things. Cattle passed through in restless clusters, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. Buyers nodded, hands flicked upward. Deals were made without ceremony. The man watched without much interest, his gaze drifting, his thoughts heavy and unformed. He told himself he would leave soon, that this place had nothing left to offer him. Then he saw the horse. It stood at the far end of the yard, half hidden behind a sagging rail, as if the world had gently pushed it aside. The horse was enormous, a draft breed once built for strength, yet its size now seemed like a burden it had grown tired of carrying. Its head hung low, mane tangled and dull, ribs faintly visible beneath a coat that had lost its shine. Scars traced pale lines along its legs, old reminders of labor and neglect. While other animals shifted and called out, this one remained still, breathing slow, eyes dark and distant. Men nearby laughed softly when they noticed it. Someone shook his head and muttered a word that stung more than it should have. Useless. Another voice suggested the horse wouldn't last a winter. The auctioneer barely bothered to raise his tone when the time came, listing age and weight with mechanical indifference, already preparing to move on. The horse did not react. It didn't pull against the rope or stamp the ground. It didn't even look up. Its stillness felt deliberate, like a quiet refusal to ask for anything more. The man felt something tighten in his chest. He tried to look away, embarrassed by the sudden heat behind his eyes, but his gaze returned as if pulled by gravity. In the horse's posture, he recognized a familiarity that unsettled him, the way it stood apart, conserving energy, enduring without protest, the way it seemed to have learned that resistance only led to more pain. He had stood like that once, not so long ago, waiting for life to pass him by without making demands. The bidding began, slow and half-hearted. Numbers were called into the fog and fell unanswered. The man's mind filled with reasons to leave. He had no space for another responsibility, no money to waste on a lost cause. He told himself compassion was a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet his feet stayed rooted in the mud, and his eyes never left the horse. With each passing second, the silence around the bidding grew heavier, until it felt like the entire yard was holding its breath. The auctioneer paused, impatience creeping into his voice as he called for a final offer. The rope at the horse's neck lay slack. Its ears flicked once, barely perceptible, then settled again. Something about that small movement broke through the man's defenses. He imagined the horse being led away, loaded without ceremony, disappearing into some final, unremarked ending. The thought struck him with a sharpness he hadn't expected, cutting through the numbness he had carried for months. His hand rose before he fully understood the decision. It was not a confident gesture, more a reflex than a declaration, fingers lifting slightly above his coat sleeve. The number left his mouth quietly, almost swallowed by the fog, but it was enough. The auctioneer nodded, surprised, then called the sale with a quick strike of the bell. The sound rang out, sudden and final, echoing across the yard. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The murmurs resumed, the fog shifted, and the world carried on as it always did. But the man remained still, his heart pounding, a strange mix of dread and relief washing through him. He looked at the horse again, expecting nothing, and yet the animal lifted its head just enough for their eyes to meet. There was no gratitude there, no spark of hope, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if something unseen had been agreed upon. As handlers moved closer, the man felt the weight of what he had done settle over him. He had not solved anything. He had not rescued a miracle. He had simply chosen not to walk away. And standing there in the thinning fog, with mud on his boots and uncertainty tightening his throat, he sensed that this choice, small and impulsive as it seemed, had shifted the direction of his life. The horse turned slightly toward him, and in that subtle movement, the morning found its climax, leaving both of them balanced on the edge of something neither yet understood. The auction yard woke slowly, as if reluctant to face the day. Fog clung to the ground in thin, wavering sheets, blurring the edges of rusted gates and weather-beaten trailers. The air smelled of damp hay, old iron, and animals that had learned patience the hard way. Boots shuffled through mud, voices stayed low, and somewhere a bell rang with tired insistence. It was a kind of morning that pressed down on a man's shoulders, inviting him to keep his head lowered and his thoughts to himself. He stood apart from the others, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, shoulders curved inward as though bracing against more than the cold. His name barely mattered here. He had driven in before sunrise, not because he needed a horse, but because sleep had refused him again. Home felt too quiet these days, too full of echoes that followed him from room to room. Among strangers and livestock, he could pretend he was simply another face in the crowd, unobserved and unburdened. The auctioneer's voice cut through the mist, rhythmic and detached, assigning numbers and prices to living things. Cattle passed through in restless clusters, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. Buyers nodded. Hands flicked upward. Deals were made without ceremony. The man watched without much interest, his gaze drifting, his thoughts heavy and unformed. He told himself he would leave soon, that this place had nothing left to offer him. Then he saw the horse. It stood at the far end of the yard, half hidden behind a sagging rail, as if the world had gently pushed it aside. The horse was enormous, a draft breed once built for strength, yet its size now seemed like a burden it had grown tired of carrying. Its head hung low, manette tangled and dull, ribs faintly visible beneath a coat that had lost its shine. Scars traced pale lines along its legs, old reminders of labor and neglect. While other animals shifted and cooled out, this one remained still, breathing slow, eyes dark and distant. Men nearby laughed softly when they noticed it. Someone shook his head and muttered a word that stung more than it should have. Useless. Another voice suggested the horse wouldn't last a winter. The auctioneer barely bothered to raise his tone when the time came, listing age and weight with mechanical indifference, already preparing to move on. The horse did not react. It didn't pull against the rope or stamp the ground. It didn't even look up. Its stillness felt deliberate, like a quiet refusal to ask for anything more. The man felt something tighten in his chest. He tried to look away, embarrassed by the sudden heat behind his eyes, but his gaze returned as if pulled by gravity. In the horse's posture, he recognized a familiarity that unsettled him, the way it stood apart, conserving energy, enduring without protest, the way it seemed to have learned that resistance only led to more pain. He had stood like that once, not so long ago, waiting for life to pass him by without making demands. The bidding began, slow and half-hearted. Numbers were called into the fog and fell unanswered. The man's mind filled with reasons to leave. He had no space for another responsibility, no money to waste on a lost cause. He told himself compassion was a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet his feet stayed rooted in the mud, and his eyes never left the horse. With each passing second, the silence around the bidding grew heavier, until it felt like the entire yard was holding its breath. The auctioneer paused, impatience creeping into his voice as he called for a final offer. The rope at the horse's neck lay slack. Its ears flicked once, barely perceptible, then settled again. Something about that small movement broke through the man's defenses. He imagined the horse being led away, loaded without ceremony, disappearing into some final, unremarked ending. The thought struck him with a sharpness he hadn't expected, cutting through the numbness he had carried for months. His hand rose before he fully understood the decision. It was not a confident gesture, more a reflex than a declaration, fingers lifting slightly above his coat sleeve. The number left his mouth quietly, almost swallowed by the fog, but it was enough. The auctioneer nodded, surprised, then called the sale with a quick strike of the bell. The sound rang out, sudden and final, echoing across the yard. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The murmurs resumed, the fog shifted, and the world carried on as it always did. But the man remained still, his heart pounding, a strange mix of dread and relief washing through him. He looked at the horse again, expecting nothing, and yet the animal lifted its head just enough for their eyes to meet. There was no gratitude there, no spark of hope, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if something unseen had been agreed upon. As handlers moved closer, the man felt the weight of what he had done settle over him. He had not solved anything. He had not rescued a miracle. He had simply chosen not to walk away. And standing there in the thinning fog, with mud on his boots and uncertainty tightening his throat, he sensed that this choice, small and impulsive as it seemed, had shifted the direction of his life. The horse turned slightly toward him, and in that subtle movement, the morning found its climax, leaving both of them balanced on the edge of something neither yet understood. The first true test came without warning, arriving on an ordinary afternoon when the sky darkened faster than expected. A wind rose across the fields, rattling the loose boards of the barn and sending dry leaves skittering like nervous thoughts along the ground. He was inside the stall, replacing a loose plank, when the sound of metal striking metal rang out sharp and sudden. The horse startled violently, muscles coiling, body surging backward with a force that surprised them both. Its eyes went white at the edges, breath tearing from its chest in panicked bursts. For a moment, instinct screamed at him to act, to grab the rope, to assert control before the situation spiraled. His heart pounded, memories flashing of other moments in his life when chaos had demanded quick decisions and punished hesitation. But he stayed where he was. He lowered his hands, slowed his breathing, and spoke softly, not to calm the horse as much as to steady himself. The words mattered less than the tone, a low, even sound that carried no judgment and no urgency. The horse trembled, hooves scraping against the stall floor, caught between flight and exhaustion. Seconds stretched thin. Then, gradually, the tension ebbed. Its breathing slowed, shoulders dropping by degrees until it stood again, shaken but present. The crisis passed without triumph, leaving behind only the residue of fear and a fragile understanding that neither of them had been harmed. He stepped back, giving space, and the horse accepted it without retreating further. It was a small victory, if it could be called that, but it left him drained. That night, doubt returned with a vengeance. He lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees, replaying the moment again and again. What if next time he failed? What if patience wasn't enough? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, familiar and suffocating. He had known this feeling before, the fear of being needed when he wasn't sure he had anything left to give. The horse slept in the barn, unaware of his turmoil, its steady presence a silent question he could not yet answer. Morning arrived gray and cold. He carried feed as usual, but his steps were heavier, his mind clouded. The horse approached the bucket slowly, eyes flicking toward him, then away. It ate, but without the tentative ease it had begun to show. Something between them had tightened again, not broken, but strained. He recognized the pattern immediately. Trust, once unsettled, did not mend itself quickly. It required renewed effort, renewed patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without forcing resolution. Days followed in uneven rhythm. Some passed quietly, marked by routine and small signs of progress. Others felt like setbacks, the horse shying from a sudden movement or stiffening under his touch. Each reaction stirred frustration he tried hard to hide. He reminded himself that healing did not move in straight lines, that survival left marks that could not be erased by kindness alone. Still, there were moments when he wondered if he was only prolonging the inevitable, clinging to a hope that had no foundation. On one such afternoon, as he brushed dried mud from the horse's flank, his hand slipped, grazing an old scar. The horse reacted instantly, jerking away, muscles locking in reflexive defense. He froze, heart sinking, anger at himself flaring hot and brief. He stepped back, letting the brush fall, and waited. The horse did not bolt. It stood there, tense, uncertain. It was flicking back and forth as if weighing its options. Slowly, the tension eased. The horse turned its head just enough to look at him, dark eyes searching. The moment lingered, fragile as glass. He resisted the urge to reach out again, to fix what he felt he had broken. Instead, he stayed still, offering nothing but presence. After a long breath, the horse shifted its weight and returned to the brush, nudging it lightly with its nose. The gesture was hesitant, almost questioning. His chest tightened as understanding settled in. The horse was not asking for perfection. It was asking for honesty, for a partner who would remain even after mistakes. That realization did not erase the struggle, but it changed its shape. He stopped measuring progress by visible milestones and began paying attention to subtler signs. The way the horse stood closer than before. The way it no longer pressed itself into corners. The way its breathing matched his when he lingered nearby. These were not dramatic changes, but they were real and they mattered. In attending to them, he found his own thoughts growing quieter, his internal noise softened by shared routine. There were evenings when he sat outside the stall long after his chores were done, watching the light fade through the slats in the barn walls. The horse would stand nearby, not touching, but close enough that he could feel its warmth. In those moments, he allowed himself to feel the weight he had been carrying, the grief and fatigue he rarely named. He did not speak of it, not even to himself. He simply let it exist alongside the steady presence of another being who understood endurance without explanation. One night, as the stars sharpened overhead and the air cooled, the horse stepped forward and rested its muzzle briefly against his shoulder. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, but it carried a quiet intensity that left him breathless. He did not move. He did not reach up or turn his head. He let the moment pass as it had come, unclaimed and unspoiled. When the horse stepped away, he felt the absence like an echo, but also a certainty taking root. He understood then that resistance was part of the bond forming between them, not an obstacle to it. Each hesitation, each moment of fear, was an invitation to choose patience again. And as he rose to leave the barn, closing the door gently behind him, he knew that whatever lay ahead would demand more of him than he had planned to give. Yet for the first time in a long while, the thought did not send him retreating. It anchored him, steady and awake, ready to continue. People began to appear at the edges of his days without announcement, as quietly as a horse had entered his life. It started with a neighbor slowing his truck near the fence, engine idling while he watched from a distance. No wave, no greeting, just a brief pause before moving on. Then a pair of children wandered up one afternoon, bikes abandoned in the grass, their curiosity stronger than their shyness. They stood at the gate, whispering, eyes fixed on the massive shape in the pasture. He noticed them only when the horse did, its ears turning toward the sound of their laughter, head lifting with cautious interest. He might have sent them away. Once, he would have. Instead, he opened the gate and motioned them closer, keeping his movement slow and unthreatening. The children approached in uneven steps, holding their breath as if afraid the moment might shatter. The horse remained still, watching, evaluating. When one of the children reached out a tentative hand and touched the coarse hair at its shoulder, the horse did not flinch. The relief on the child's face was instant and unguarded, a smile blooming as if something heavy had been set down at last. Word traveled in the subtle ways it always did in small places. A mother came next, then an older man who walked with a careful stiffness, his gaze distant until it softened in the presence of the animal. No one asked permission. No one made speeches. They came, lingered, and left, carrying something quieter back with them. The land seemed to absorb their presence, growing warmer with each visit, as though the soil itself remembered what it meant to be shared. He found himself preparing without thinking, sweeping the barn more thoroughly, stacking hay with greater care. These small acts felt purposeful in a way his old routines never had. The horse noticed, too. It stood more openly now, no longer hugging walls or retreating at every sound. It watched the visitors with calm curiosity, its strength evident but no longer intimidating. Children learned quickly where to stand, how to move, their voices lowering instinctively as they sensed the gravity of the animal beside them. One afternoon, a teenager appeared, tall and withdrawn, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a hooded sweatshirt despite the warmth of the day. He lingered at the fence longer than most, eyes downcast, shoulders tense. The man said nothing, only opened the gate and stepped aside. The boy hesitated, then entered, his movement stiff and uncertain. The horse approached him slowly, stopping just short, head lowered. The boy did not reach out. He simply stood there, breathing unevenly until his shoulders began to relax. Watching them, the man felt a recognition sharper than any mirror. He saw himself in the boy's guarded posture, in the way he seemed prepared for rejection even in silence. He understood then that the horse was doing something he could not articulate, offering a space where fear did not need explanation. The boy returned the next day, and the day after that. He never said much, but his presence grew steadier, his steps more confident. Healing, it seemed, did not always announce itself. Evenings took on a different texture. The barn filled with quiet conversations, laughter subdued out of respect rather than instruction. People sat on overturned buckets or leaned against rails, sharing the simple comfort of being near something solid and alive. The horse moved among them with careful grace, accepting touches, offering its weight and warmth as if it understood its role. The man watched from a short distance, a strange fullness settling in his chest. He had not planned this. He had not invited it. Yet it unfolded as naturally as breath. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. Responsibility crept back in, whispering of expectations and failure. He reminded himself that this was not a mission or a calling, just a series of small, honest choices made daily. He fed the horse. He opened the gate. He stayed present. Everything else followed on its own. In releasing the need to control outcomes, he felt something in himself loosen, an old knot of tension slowly untying. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in amber light, he noticed how the horse stood at the center of the gathering. Children leaning against its flank, adults resting hands on its broad shoulders. The animal breathed deeply, steady and unafraid. The sight struck him with unexpected force. He stepped back, away from the group, and let the moment wash over him. This was no longer just his quiet refuge. It was becoming a shared one, a place where people came to remember parts of themselves they had set aside. As the visitors drifted away, leaving behind the hush of dusk, he returned to barn and closed the gate. The horse followed, stopping beside him, its presence solid and reassuring. He rested a hand against its neck, feeling the warmth beneath the coarse hair. In that touch, he sensed the scale of what was unfolding, not as a burden, but as a widening circle of connection. He did not know where it would lead or how far it would reach. He only knew that something larger than his own healing was beginning to take shape, and for the first time, the thought filled him not with fear, but with quiet awe. The idea took root slowly, almost imperceptibly, like grass pushing through packed earth. He did not announce it, did not frame it as a plan. It revealed itself in the way he repaired the far fence instead of letting it sag, in the extra buckets he lined up by the barn wall, in the way he began arriving early each morning and staying long after the light had thinned. The land responded to attention the way living things often did, offering more the more it was trusted. Paths formed where feet passed regularly. The barn grew cleaner, brighter, less like a place of storage and more like a place of return. People adjusted to the rhythm without being asked. The children learned when to come and when to give space. The older man with a careful walk started bringing a folding chair, settling into a sigh that sounded like relief. The teenager began helping without instruction, lifting hay bales, brushing the horse's coat with steady hands. None of them spoke about why they were there. It was understood without words, an agreement built on shared quiet rather than explanation. The horse carried the center of it all with remarkable patience. Its movements grew surer, its presence more expansive. Where it had once stood as if bracing for disappearance, it now occupied space freely, head held higher, eyes alert and curious. The man noticed how the horse seemed to sense people's needs before they did themselves, turning toward the anxious, lingering beside the withdrawn. He had seen intelligence in animals before, but this felt different, as though the horse were attuned to something deeper than routine or reward. One afternoon, a woman arrived with a small boy who clung to her hand, his gaze fixed on the ground. The woman's face was drawn tight with exhaustion, her smile practiced and fragile. She explained nothing, and he asked nothing in return. He opened the gate and let them enter at their own pace. The boy stopped several steps in, frozen, shoulders hunched, breath shallow. The horse noticed immediately. It turned and approached slowly, lowering itself to the child's height, careful and deliberate. The boy did not retreat. He watched the horse with wide, unblinking eyes, as if afraid that blinking might make it vanish. Minutes passed. The wind moved softly through the grass. Somewhere, a bird called. Then, almost without realizing it, the boy lifted his hand and rested it against the horse's neck. The contact was tentative, barely a touch, but the horse responded by leaning ever so slightly into it, offering warmth and steadiness in equal measure. The woman's breath caught. She covered her mouth, eyes filling, and sank down onto the grass as if her legs could no longer support her. The man felt something tighten behind his ribs, a pressure that threatened to rise into his throat. He stayed where he was, refusing to intrude on the moment. The boy's fingers curled slowly into the horse's mane. His shoulders dropped. A sound escaped him, soft and surprised, not quite a word but close enough to make the air feel electric. No one moved. No one spoke. The world seemed to hold itself still, aware that something fragile and profound was unfolding. The horse remained steady, breathing deep, its massive body a quiet promise of safety. The boy leaned closer, resting his forehead against the horse's shoulder. When he spoke again, the sound was clearer this time, a single whispered syllable that carried more weight than a shout. The woman sobbed quietly, pressing her face into her hands, undone by the simplicity of it. The man stepped back, overwhelmed by the force of what he was witnessing. He had believed he was offering refuge, nothing more. He had not imagined moments like this, moments that rearranged the shape of a life in an instant. He understood then that the horse was no longer just companion or mirror. It was a bridge, spanning distances he had never known how to cross. Through it, people were finding parts of themselves they had thought were gone for good. That evening, after the woman and child had left, after the barn had emptied and dusk settled in, he remained standing in the fading light. The horse stood beside him, close enough that he could feel its breath against his arm. He rested his forehead briefly against its neck, a gesture he had never allowed himself before. The warmth steadied him. In that quiet contact, clarity emerged, not as a grand vision but as a simple truth. This place, this bond, was no longer only about healing what had been broken. It was about protecting what was still possible. As the stars began to appear, sharp and numerous above the darkened fields, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him, heavy but welcome. The path ahead would demand more than patience. It would demand commitment, endurance, and a willingness to let the work grow beyond him. He did not yet know what shape it would take, only that he would not turn away. The horse shifted slightly, as if in agreement, and together they stood, balanced on the edge of a future that had already begun to change them both. Time moved differently after that, stretching and folding in ways he could not quite track. Weeks slipped into months, marked less by dates than by changes so gradual they were only visible in hindsight. The fence line straightened. The pasture grew quieter, not from absence, but from a settled calm. People came and went with a new familiarity, no longer hesitant, no longer surprised by what they found there. The land held them all with a steady patience that felt earned. He began waking before dawn, not out of restlessness, but anticipation. The early hour belonged to him and the horse alone. The world reduced a breath, hoof prints, and the pale light lifting over the fields. He brushed the horse slowly, hands following contours he now knew by heart. The animal stood with eyes half closed, leaning subtly into the rhythm, trusting him with its weight and its stillness. In those moments, he felt anchored, as if some invisible thread had tied him firmly to the present. Others noticed a change in him before he did. His movements were surer, his posture less guarded. The heaviness he once carried did not vanish, but it no longer bent him inward. When people spoke to him, he listened fully, no longer searching for an exit. He found himself offering small reassurances without thinking, a nod, a shared silence, a simple acknowledgement that pain did not need to be fixed to be honored. The barn evolved with the same quiet intention. Extra stalls were cleared, not because he had planned to fill them, but because space invited possibility. Mats were laid, fresh paint brightened the walls, and the scent of hay mixed with something lighter, almost hopeful. Children began helping with chores, learning to move carefully around the horse, their laughter subdued but genuine. The teenager took on more responsibility, arriving early, staying late, his presence steady and reliable. The older man with a careful walk started sleeping better, or so he said, his eyes clearer each time he returned. The horse remained a constant center, its demeanor calm and grounded. It seemed to recognize when someone needed proximity and when they needed distance, adjusting its presence with an intuition that defied explanation. He watched as people changed around it, shoulders lowering, breath deepening, voices softening. The horse did not demand anything from them. It simply existed, solid and unjudging, and that seemed to be enough. One afternoon, a veteran arrived unannounced, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting threat. He stood apart at first, arms crossed tight against his chest. The man approached him slowly, said little, and gestured toward the pasture. The veteran hesitated, then followed at a distance. The horse noticed him immediately, lifting its head, ears turning forward. It did not approach. It waited. The veteran stood there for a long time, breathing unevenly, before finally stepping closer. When he reached out and touched the horse's shoulder, his hand shook violently. The horse remained steady. Later, the veteran would say he slept through the night for the first time in years. These moments accumulated, layering meaning upon meaning until the place felt charged with something almost sacred. He resisted the urge to name it, afraid that labeling it might shrink it. Instead, he focused on what was required: consistency, humility, care. He learned to step back when needed, to let the horse lead interactions, to trust the process unfolding beyond his control. In doing so, he found a freedom he had not known he was missing. The realization came one evening as the sun dipped low, bathing the fields in copper light. He stood at the fence, watching a small group gathered near the barn. Children brushing the horse, the teenager laughing quietly with them, the older man resting nearby, eyes closed in contentment. The horse shifted its weight, patient and attentive, a living axis around which these lives now turned. The sight struck him with sudden clarity. This was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a place of return, a space where broken rhythms could be relearned. The thought unsettled him, not with fear, but with awe. He had not set out to build anything lasting. He had only chosen, once, not to walk away. And yet here it was, taking shape around him, asking to be protected, nurtured, allowed to grow. Responsibility pressed in, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt purposeful, like a weight meant to strengthen rather than crush. As dusk settled, he walked back to the barn, the horse falling into step beside him. Inside, the air was warm, familiar. He closed the door gently, leaning his forehead against the wood for a brief moment, grounding himself. When he turned, the horse was there, close and attentive. He rested a hand against its neck, gratitude swelling in his chest. He understood now that this journey was not about rescue or redemption, or even healing alone. It was about belonging, the kind that grows when patience meets presence and when care is offered without expectation. And standing there in the dim light, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that whatever this place would become, it had already changed him forever. The child arrived on a morning that felt too quiet, the kind that made small sounds echo longer than they should. A woman stepped out of a car that had seen better years, her movements careful, as if any sudden shift might send everything spilling apart. She held the child's hand tightly, though the child did not seem to notice. His gaze stayed fixed somewhere far away, beyond the fence, beyond the pasture, beyond the moment itself. He had learned not to ask questions. He opened the gate and let them in, the hinges creaking softly in greeting. The woman spoke in fragments, offering only what felt safe to share. The child had not spoken since the night that changed everything. Doctors had explained. Therapists had tried. Time, everyone said, would tell. Her voice wavered, then steadied again, as if she had practiced as telling many times before. He listened, nodding once, and stepped aside to give them space. The child stopped just inside the pasture, his small body rigid, shoulders lifted as though bracing against an invisible weight. The horse was grazing nearby, its head low, movement slow and unhurried. When it noticed them, it did not approach. It simply turned, standing broadside, presenting its presence without demand. The air between them felt charged, thin as glass. The man held his breath, instinctively aware that this was not a moment to manage. Minutes passed. The woman crouched beside the child, murmuring reassurance he did not seem to hear. The horse took a single step closer, then another, its massive frame moving with deliberate care. It stopped several feet away and waited. The child's eyes lifted at last, drawn upward by the sheer size of the animal. Fear flickered across his face, quick and sharp, then something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. The horse lowered its head, bringing itself closer to the child's level. Its breathing was slow, audible, grounding. The child did not retreat. His fingers twitched at his side, an involuntary movement that caught the man's attention like a spark in dry grass. He felt his chest tighten, the weight of expectation pressing in. but he pushed it away. Hope, he had learned, could be a fragile thing if handled too roughly. The woman's eyes filled as she watched, her hands clasped tight in front of her mouth. She did not intervene. She had learned, through long and painful experience, that forcing moments like this only drove them further out of reach. The horse shifted its weight, settling into stillness. The child took a step forward, then another, each one a quiet act of courage. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering inches from the horse's neck. Time seemed to slow, stretching the instant until it felt unreal. When the child's fingers finally made contact, the horse did not flinch. Its skin rippled once beneath the touch, then stilled. The child inhaled sharply, as if surprised by the warmth, the solidity. He pressed his palm more firmly now, anchoring himself. His shoulders dropped. The tension that had held his small body rigid loosened, just enough to let breath move freely. A sound escaped him, barely more than A-shaped by intention. The woman gasped, a sharp intake she tried unsuccessfully to swallow back. The man felt his vision blur, the world narrowing to this single point of connection. The horse remained steady, its presence unwavering, as if it understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. The child leaned closer, resting his forehead against the horse's shoulder, his breathing evening out. Then it happened. Soft, uncertain, but unmistakable. A word formed, fragile as a newborn thing, carried on a breath that trembled with effort. It was not loud. It was not clear, but it was real. The woman sank to her knees, sobbing openly now, hands shaking as she reached for her child without touching him, afraid to break the spell. The man stepped back, heart pounding, aware that this moment did not belong to him. The horse lifted its head slightly, as if acknowledging the shift, and the child looked up, eyes wide with something close to wonder. Another sound followed, not quite a word, but closer than before. The barn, the pasture, the world itself seemed to exhale. In that fragile, astonishing instant, the man understood that he was witnessing something beyond healing. This was reclamation, a voice finding its way home. And as the horse stood there, patient and unassuming, he felt the full weight of what they had built crest and break, leaving him forever changed in its wake. If this story touched something in your heart, don't let the moment pass. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds you what healing really looks like. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most, and the next one might change you in ways you don't expect.